Yassas. Welcome to Greek Like Me, the podcast about all things Greek. I'm your host, Pamela Diodes Wood. Email us at stealthgreek@gmail.com to share comments, questions, and stories about Greeks, Greekness, or your own ethnic background. I sound like Rhoda Morgenstern after she smoked a couple of packets of cigarettes. I apologize. It's February 2025, the second anniversary of the Greek Like Me podcast. Most podcasts fail within their first year, 90%, and we're still here. Commencing year 3. So please keep tuning in, like, and subscribe to keep us going. I've been dealing with sudden vision loss in one eye since early November. Treatments, complications, yeah. Why we took an unplanned hiatus. Reading and writing has been a challenge. It's taking me longer to do things as I adjust to my new reality, but I'm anxious to get back to work, and I'm taking advantage of new tools to help me, including a suggestion from friend and listener Martha to try a knitter's neck lamp. If you have vision issues, or you're a crafter, or like to read in bed without lighting up the whole room, I strongly recommend it. It's almost gotten me back up to speed. I bought mine from Hobby, Hobbii, a Danish company, and it's been a life changer. We're hoping to drop 2 episodes a month for the time being, and we published our YouTube channel in January. For now, it's audio only, the entire podcast catalog, but we plan on making accompanying short videos about Greekness. We're excited. Thanks for coming along for the ride. Today, we recognize Valentine's Day, a day all about love stories. A month when our televisions and streaming services are invaded by complicated love stories with hilarious misunderstandings that always end happily ever after. In my Greek world, the love stories are most often tragic. There's rarely a happy ending. The Greek myths are rife with excruciating tales of love lost, love murdered by jealous wives, love dismembered. It can be disturbing, but more intriguing than a Hallmark movie. There is no love story more tragic than that of Orpheus and Eurydice. Wait, let's pronounce their names correctly. Orpheus and Eurydice. Orpheus is famed throughout the ages for his extraordinary devotion to his beloved Eurydice. So extraordinary, he willingly faced the Lord of Death to bring her home. Orpheus is the most famous musician in Greek mythology. The gods were the first musicians, but Orpheus was so skilled in singing and playing the lyre, or lyra, he equaled the god of music himself, Apollo. Some say Apollo fathered Orpheus, gifted him his first lyra, and even tutored him. His mother was Calliope, one of the 9 muses, the daughters of Zeus and Mnemosyne, the goddess of memory. The muses were the source of inspiration for the arts, poetry, theater, song, dance, and of history and astronomy. They were summoned by artists, scientists, poets, and historians in the throes of creation. Calliope was the muse of epic poetry. 8th century BCE Greek poet Hesiodus, explaining the lineage of the gods in Theogony, calls her the most important muse, the muse who taught kings. In most iterations of the myth of Orpheus, his father is believed to be mortal, Iagros, the king of Thrace, where legend says the lyra came from after its inventions by Hermes. But I'm not going to get into the archaeological debate of Iraq as origin of the instrument. We're talking about Greek mythology. The ancient myths, like ancient recipes, were handed down orally through generations for hundreds upon hundreds of years. By the time they were written down, variations naturally had occurred. Orpheus, son of goddess muse Calliope, may have had a god or a mortal for a father, but either way he was well connected to Olympus. I fall in the Iagros camp because throughout the stories Orpheus is designated immortal, or more than immortal, because of his mother's lineage. Edith Hamilton, educator and lifelong student of classical literature, wrote the book Mythology in 1942, long considered the definitive introduction of ancient Greek myths to the Western world. It was required reading when I was in high school. As far as I know, it hasn't been banned yet. Hamilton says of Orpheus, his mother gave him the gift of music and Thrace, where he grew up, fostered it. She tells us Thracians were the most musical people of Greece, and when Orpheus played, no one and nothing could resist him. Music was his superpower. This incredible musical talent is extremely important in his almost successful defiance of death for the sake of love. Mark Cartwright in World History Encyclopedia says the music of Orpheus charmed the wild animals out of the forest, and even streams would pause and trees bend closer to hear his singing. He moved the rocks on the hillside and turned the course of rivers. Robert Graves, another scholar of ancient Greek texts and author of the Greek myths, recounts a legend in Thrace that there are still ancient oaks standing in a pattern of one of Orpheus's dances, frozen in time when he finished playing. 6th century BCE poet Simonides says, above his head there hovered birds innumerable, and fishes leapt clear from the blue water because of his sweet music. Orpheus has a number of adventures as a young hero before he meets the love of his life. He traveled through Egypt. He was the tutor of a prince who would later become King Midas of the Golden Touch. One of his most important contributions to the myths was joining Jason, rightful heir to the throne of Iolcos, and his Argonauts in a quest to retrieve the Golden Fleece. The usurper of Jason's throne, his evil uncle, believes he is sending Jason and his comrades to their deaths, because many dangers stand between them and their prize. Orpheus is listed on the rolls of the crew as Orpheus, the Thracian poet. Hundreds of great Greek heroes joined the crew of the Argo, facing death at the mercy of monsters of land and the sea. Throughout their mission, Orpheus uses his musical skills to entertain the crew, to calm them when they're frightened, to halt drunken brawls between the Argonauts or between the Argonauts and the citizens of the places where they made land. He plays to refresh and strengthen the men and set the pace as they row across the sea when the wind fails. He calms stormy seas. That's how great his power is. One of the greatest threats the Argonauts faced was the sirens, or sirines. Half woman, half bird, their voices were bewitching. Daughters of the muse of dance, the sirines are cousins of Orpheus. The muses used their voices as their instruments, and the sirines inherited their skill just as their cousin Orpheus did. They inhabited a rocky shore on the island of Anthemoessa. Singing such sweet, intoxicating songs, sailors were lured to their destruction, running their ships onto the rocks, or threw themselves into the sea to drown. As the Argo passed their island, the sirines sang their haunting songs of enchantment, driving the Argonauts half mad. The ship and its crew should have been doomed. But Orpheus was seemingly unaffected by their hypnotic voices, perhaps because he was more than mortal. Apollodorus says he began a song to counter their own, thus holding the Argonauts back. His song countered the deadly magic of the sirines with magic of his own, giving us insight into the beliefs of those who shared the stories of Orpheus. Cartwright points out the story is an early example of the ancient Greeks' faith in the magical powers of music. It could lure you to your death, protect you from danger, or cause the trees to dance. When Jason and his crew finally reach the Golden Fleece, they find it guarded by a dragon that never sleeps. Some claim it was Orpheus' singing that lulled the dragon to finally rest, allowing Jason to snatch the fleece and escape unharmed. But according to Apollonius in Argonautica, it was a potion distilled by the princess witch Medea that made the dragon sleep. After the long, arduous journey of the Argo, Orpheus returned to wild places and began wandering, playing his music. The wood nymphs, called dryads, played in the woods where he sang. Like every other thing living or inanimate, they were drawn to his music. The dryad Eurydice was exceptionally beautiful, and Orpheus immediately fell in love with her. Whether she fell in love with him as suddenly or was seduced by the music no one could resist, sources disagree. Hamilton acknowledges that details of their courtship is unknown, but it is clear that no maiden he wanted could have resisted the power of his song. In any case, they were happily entwined, and Eurydice danced to the music of Orpheus, and they became inseparable. Hymenaeus, the god of wedding ceremonies and song, officiated their marriage in the forest and at the wedding feast. Some accounts say Hymenaeus blessed the union, unaware of the fate of the new bride and groom. Others that when the god lit a ceremonial torch, it emanated a black smoke, causing him to forget to bless the wedding, a double whammy of a bad omen. More often, it's told that he warned them after the blessing that their union would be short and tragic. And he was right, because Eurydice would die before their wedding night. Aristeos, sometimes identified as a shepherd, but better known as a demigod, had fallen in love with Eurydice from afar, or more likely in lust. Aristeos was the son of Apollo and Kyrene, a water nymph and princess of Thessaly. The Muses, the mother and aunts of Orpheus, taught him the arts of healing, ironically. He's credited with bringing bees to Greece and is the god of beekeeping. Bees were his passion until Eurydice. As she and her new groom walked through the woods, Aristeos stalked them, planning to ambush Orpheus, to injure or kill him, and steal Eurydice away. Greek myths are rampant with randy gods or men snatching the objects of their lust against their will, and the suffering it inflicts on everyone involved. Like many modern-day men, the killer/rapists often get away with it. Graves suggests the beekeeper only tried to woo her with words of love and kisses directly after her wedding to Orpheus. He wrote this in the 1950s, equating lust with love, romanticizing a violent and degrading act. Orpheus evaded the attack from Aristeos, and Eurydice ran in terror, attempting to escape the demigod. She wasn't interested. She stumbled into a viper's nest. A snake bit her on the ankle, and as the cowardly Aristeos, the muse-trained healer, fled, Eurydice turned pale and died in the arms of her love. Before Orpheus could comprehend what had happened, she was spirited away to the underworld. Orpheus grieved the loss of his beloved, unable to accept her death. He was determined to have her back, to descend into the underworld to retrieve her. In The Complete World of Greek Mythology, Richard Buxton says Orpheus takes a step which only the greatest heroes could contemplate to try to reverse the inevitable process of mortality by bringing his wife back to the world of the living. His plan was to use his greatest weapon to retrieve his bride, his music, to appeal to Hades and his queen, Persephone. With my song, I will charm Demeter's daughter. I will charm the Lord of the Dead, moving their hearts with my melody. I will bear her away from Hades. Orpheus finds one of the 3 earthly passages to the underworld and ventures into the darkness, singing and playing his lyra, the only hero besides Heracles and Theseus to voluntarily make the journey into the underworld. First, he encountered cold, impassive Charon, the ferryman who carried the dead across the river Styx into the kingdom of Hades. His music charmed the ferryman, and Charon takes him across the Styx to the gates of hell. Kerberos, the hound of Hades, a man-eating 3-headed dog with a serpent's tail, guarded the gate into the underworld. No living thing could enter. But Orpheus lulled the creature, who lets him pass and wander among the teeming souls of the dead. Phantoms of men and women, heroes and children, haunted the depths of Hades. Next, Orpheus captivated the 3 judges of the dead, those who judge the actions and lives of the recently dead to decide their fates in the afterlife. They also allowed him to pass. Graves says the music of Orpheus temporarily suspended the tortures of the damned. Sisyphus pushing his rock uphill eternally, Tantalus trying to sip unreachable waters to end his unquenchable thirst. Tityus, the giant, whose liver was eaten eternally by vultures, all stopped to listen. The terrifying, vengeful Furies sent to the mortal world to pursue and destroy the wicked were shaken. Hamilton says, for the first time the faces of the dread goddesses were wet with tears. Ovid writes, while he sang, all his heart said, to the sound of his sweet lyra, the bloodless ghosts themselves were weeping. All who existed in the underworld fell under his spell. Nor could the royal queen nor he who rules the lower world deny the prayer of Orpheus. Sophocles said of Hades, he knows no forbearance or favor or anything but strict justice. Yet Plutarch tells us, before lovers his genius stands rebuked, and they alone find him neither implacable nor relentless. He listened spellbound as Orpheus sang of his love for Eurydice and her life cut short too soon. He sang that all lives belonged in the end to Hades, but begged him to release her for only the short time that mortals live, and then they would return to him together. If Hades would not release her, he begged that he could stay in the underworld with her. Virgil, using the Roman name for the god, wrote that Orpheus drew iron tears down Pluto's cheek and made hell grant what love did seek. Eurydice was brought out before the sovereign of the underworld and reunited with Orpheus. She would be allowed to return to the mortal world with him under one condition. Orpheus would lead his love back to the earth, but not turn to look at her until both of them stood in the mortal world. Otherwise, she would be forced to return to the darkness. The lovers moved through the gate of Hades and began their journey upward, through the darkness, back towards the mortal world. Orpheus played his lyra, and the shadow of Eurydice followed the sound of his music. He could hear her soft footsteps behind him. The passage back to earth was long and dark and difficult, but the darkness began to grow lighter as they finally approached the world of the living. Orpheus grew anxious, wondering if Eurydice still walked behind him. His temptation to look back was excruciating, as he imagined he would be holding his bride in his arms again soon, and so he continued on. He stepped out into the living world and felt the bright sun on his face and whirled around in his excitement to embrace Eurydice. But his arms moved through a phantom. In his impatience, he had torn toward Eurydice while she was still one step inside of the underworld. She hadn't yet stood in the light of the mortal world. He reached for her, but she began to fade back into the darkness. He stopped and turned and looked at his Eurydice, now with the light of day itself almost upon her face, and then in that very moment all was gone. No reproach passed her lips. Her last word spoken was farewell, which he could barely hear, and with no further sound she fell from him again to Hades. Frantically, Orpheus tried to follow. He ran back down the dark passage, but at the Styx he was blocked by Charon, the ferryman, who refused to carry him across until he himself became a shade. Orpheus implored in vain the ferryman to help him across the Styx again, but was denied the very hope of death. Now his music, frantic after breaking his pledge to the Lord of Death, had no effect within his kingdom. 7 days he sat upon death's riverbank in squalid misery and without food, nourished by grief, anxiety, and tears. Sick with regret, unable to persuade Hades to hear him a second time, Orpheus finally made his way alone back to the mortal world. The story is heartbreaking. But this is a Greek myth, which means Orpheus has not suffered enough. He returned to Thrace, to roam in wild places, mourning his lost love. He no longer sang with joy and life, but instead of his grief and love for Eurydice, haunting him until his own death would reunite them. He shunned women, vowing he could love only Eurydice, though some claimed he looked for comfort with young men. He worshipped the god Apollo and became a priest at his temple in Thrace, rising every morning to greet the dawn in praise of Apollo as the greatest of all gods. He drew Thracian men into the temple, where he taught them the sacred mysteries of Apollo. And on Panios Mountain in Thrace, he met a gruesome end. Some say he rejected the romantic overtures of the Maenads, women who belonged to the cult of Dionysus that celebrated fertility, wine, and music. The term Maenad is a Latin word morphed from a Greek word meaning mad or demented. In other versions, the Maenads were angry that Orpheus worshipped Apollo rather than Dionysos, or that Dionysos himself, resentful over Orpheus's refusal to honor him, sent the Maenads to punish him. Graves, who always has an interesting interpretation, says Orpheus condemned the promiscuousness of the Maenads, who, as followers of Dionysus, liked to have a good time with whoever was willing. This might be 1950s attitudes again. It seems kind of judgy for someone with a close connection to Olympus, where philandering, incest, and general naughtiness were de rigueur. The Maenads are described as raving, drunken fanatics, given to frenzied dancing and orgies. Graves says they used intoxicants other than wine, which might have included beer and fermented honey, or I have no idea what else. They either came upon Orpheus in the woods singing to the animals, or, Graves says, they invaded the temple where he was praying with the husbands of the Maenads. He says the women wore some kind of war paint. The men had left their weapons outside the temple, as was the custom. The Maenads snatched them up and broke in, murdering some of their husbands and cutting Orpheus to pieces. The other version of the myth aligns better with what we know about the Maenads and their religious practice. When they took part in the orgiastic rites of Dionysos, these women stampeded around the countryside, crazy dancing, while possessed by the god they worshipped. In this state, they had superhuman strength, which enabled them to tear people to pieces. Apparently, this isn't the first time that happened. The frenzied Maenads came upon Orpheus in the woods, attacked him, and dismembered him with their bare hands. Dionysus may have saved the lives of the Maenads, who would surely have been punished for their crime, by turning them into oak trees. But Plutarch writes that the Maenads who killed Orpheus were punished by their husbands, who tattooed them as a warning against the murder of priests. Graves claims that the custom of husbands tattooing their wives continued for generations in Thrace, at least up until his book was published in 1955. I couldn't find any evidence of the forced tattooing. But in ancient Thrace, sleeve tattoos on women appear to have been common and may have been a status symbol. Posing the question, was the tattooing of the women in the myth meant to explain the practice by outsiders who didn't understand the body art? Or did the meaning of the tattoos in Thrace change over time? Maybe the tattoos were the war paint Graves referenced. If anyone has any way of illuminating us, please do. According to Plutarch, from the blood that fell on the mountain that day, from the broken body of Orpheus, an herb grew called the harp. During sacrifices to Dionysus, the herb made the sound of a harp being played. And yeah, I gave a quick look trying to identify this plant, but I ran out of time. In the end, Orpheus's dismembered body was left in the grass by the riverbank. The Maenads flung his lyra and his head into the Evros River. His head floated along the rushing river until it reached the sea, still singing, and washed ashore at Lesbos, completely undamaged. It was rescued by the inhabitants, and it's believed by accepting the head of Orpheus, Lesbos was given the gift of great poetic works, thus gaining its reputation as an island that generated many of Greece's great poets. And it was called the chief seat of lyric music. The head of Orpheus was placed in a sacred cave where it prophesied night and day until Apollo realized the prophesying of the severed head of Orpheus was attracting so many supplicants that his own oracles at Delphi and 2 other temples were deserted. Graves says Apollo stood over the head crying, "Cease from interference in my business. I have borne long enough with you and your singing." With that, the head of Orpheus went silent. The gods are petty. The Muses built a shrine at the site on which Cartwright tells us birds would sing in such a fashion as to recall the fabulous lost talents of Orpheus. His lyre was given to a temple of Apollo, the jealous guy, and the gods placed the lyre in the heavens as one of the constellations. Lyra is visible from the northern hemisphere. The Muses mourned him and collected what was left of Orpheus's body at the riverbank in Thrace and entombed it at the foot of Mount Olympus. There are legends that music could be heard coming from his grave. Hamilton writes that even to this day the nightingales sing more sweetly there than anywhere else. Orpheus suffered a horrific death, but his soul went down to Hades, where he was finally reunited with his love. Remember Aristeos, the demigod who set the tragic story into motion by stalking Eurydice? He was punished by the gods for what he'd done. We mentioned Aristeos brought bees to Greece. Anyone who knows anything about Greeks knows how important bees are because of meli, honey, food of the gods. Aristeos' punishment was the death of all of his beloved bees. He was forbidden to cultivate them again until he atoned by making a sacrifice to the spirit of Eurydice. He traveled to the palace of the Naiads, the water nymphs under the sea. His mother lived there. Remember, she was one of them. She told him to build 4 altars in the woods to honor Eurydice and the Dryads who were her sisters. Following her instructions, he sacrificed a bull and heifer in each, pouring libations of blood at the altars, leaving the carcasses where they lay. He was told to return 9 days later in the morning, bringing poppies of forgetfulness, a fatted calf, and a black ewe to appease the ghost of Orpheus, who had now joined Eurydice below. On the 9th day, as he returned, swarms of bees emerged from the rotting carcasses of the sacrificial animals, which Aristeos collected and put into a hive. It doesn't seem a fair exchange for all the suffering he caused. Proteus, a sea god, agrees with me. In Virgil's 4th Georgic, Proteus berates Aristeos, telling him his punishment was far less than he deserved for what he'd done to wretched Orpheus, who with heavy rage grieves that his wife is taken from his arms. He tells Aristeos he is responsible for the nymph's death and the pain of her fellow dryads, and how sick with grief Orpheus enters the portals of deep and grim, with terror black to Hades. I like that sea god. But the tale of Orpheus doesn't end there. Orphism became a cult in ancient Greece. I'm just going to summarize a little bit here because this is a big topic and not the focus of this episode. World History Encyclopedia says adherents performed certain rituals and composed or read poems, texts, and hymns, which included an alternative view of humanity's origins. Orphic priests multiplied, sharing the belief that there was life after death, that the soul left the body to journey elsewhere. The worthy who led good lives went permanently to live in a beautiful paradise. The sinful stayed in Hades, tortured for eternity. Sounds familiar. Those, neither all good nor all bad, were forced to reincarnate to a life that would determine perhaps a more permanent fate. There is a great deal more to Orphism, including an entire collection of poems, songs, and mysteries, many of which are credited to Orpheus. Orphic gold tablets have been found in burial places dating back to Hellenistic times, which, according to Andonis Chaliakopoulos, contain instructions helping the deceased navigate the underworld to free themselves from the circle of their incarnations and earn better treatment in the other life. The Dervevi papyrus, a major archaeological find, discovered in the remains of an ancient funeral pyre a few miles from Thessaloniki, dating back to the 4th century BCE, mentions Orphic deities. And Cartwright says instructions on how the soul should behave in the underworld. Humans were sparks of God, trapped in human form, and would be trapped in a cycle of rebirth until freed by the rituals of Orpheus. The tragic love story of Orpheus and Eurydice was so popular in ancient Greece, images of the lovers are depicted on pottery and in statues. And the death of Orpheus seems just as important, maybe more so. Attic vases from the 5th century BCE depict his gruesome murder. T.H. Carpenter describes one in his book Art and Myth in Ancient Greece, which is a lovely book. With only his lyra to defend himself, he is attacked by a variety of weapons. Oy. The women doing the attacking are identified as Thracian by their tattoos. So the images on the vases are Thracian women because you can tell by the tattoos. So they're already tattooed by the time they murder him. A number of 5th century BCE vases depict Orpheus' severed head speaking oracles, and sometimes the more than mortal Orpheus is simply shown at his lyra. We've put some images of these things on the website so that you can see them. Anything from the British Museum, they not only own our artwork, but they also own the images. They do not share them the way the Metropolitan Museum of Art does and other places. So much fun. Orpheus and Eurydice continue to influence artists and writers throughout the centuries. In the 1st century CE, geographer and historian Pausanias describes a statue of Orpheus on Mount Ellinikon, surrounded by animals in stone and bronze. The painters Titian, Rubens, Rodin, Poussin all depicted their story. L'Orfeo, an opera by Claudio Monteverdi, was first performed in Mantua, Italy in 1607. There were other operas and a number of operettas in the 18th and 19th centuries, including a comedy by Jacques Offenbach. In literature, the doomed lovers inspired Rilke, Pynchon, and Margaret Atwood, and my personal favorite, William Shakespeare, who featured verses on Orpheus in both the tragedy Henry VIII and his comedy Two Gentlemen of Verona. In the latter, he writes, "For Orpheus's lute was strung with poet's sinews, whose golden touch could soften steel and stones, make tigers tame, and huge leviathans forsake unsounded deeps to dance upon the sands." Jean Cocteau created a film trilogy from the tales of Orpheus. A stunning modern piece of artwork was created by Tristan McDougall, depicting the moment Eurydice is pulled away to the underworld. And with his permission, graces our announcements for this podcast. We have links in the episode notes to view it and other works he's created that were inspired by the Greek myths. British composer Harrison Birtwistle debuted his opera The Mask of Orpheus in 1986. And the Broadway musical Hadestown by Anais Mitchell debuted in 2006. Truly a love story for the ages. Thanks for listening. Greek Like Me is a Stealth Greek production. This episode was researched, written, and narrated by me, your host, Pamela Deodes Wood. Our producer, photographer, and post-production editor is Douglas John. Once again, our thanks to Tristan McDougall for allowing us to share his stunning artwork, and to Peter Samoe of Art Parks International Limited for putting us in touch with him. Additional thanks to Jay Block, Associate Director of Collections and Exhibitions at Bridgewater State University, Massachusetts, for allowing us to post a beautiful image of a more ancient piece of work from their collection on our website. Visit our website at stealthgreek.com for resources, photos, links, and more. We might even post a photo of me with my eye patch, personalized Greek style. Maybe. Please rate, like, and subscribe. It helps us get noticed so we can keep making content about Greeks and Greek culture. Find Greek Like Me on Facebook and on Instagram at Greek_like_me. See you next time. Yassas.